Another NWSL star might be on the move to England. The Women's Super League starts this weekend, and I think we are poised to see something over there that we maybe have not yet seen in their stamp on the global game. Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Claire Watkins. This is this week's edition of The Late Sub. It is Wednesday, September 3rd, and we are going to be talking about the potential transfer of Angel City star Alyssa Thompson to the WSL side, Chelsea. And we're going to just take a moment to talk about investment, this moment in the global game, momentum, and what I think the NWSL League office needs to be paying attention to as the tides start to shift, as they always do when we move into the fall. Let's dig in. So this week, I think we have to take a second and talk about some bigger picture stuff with the largest overarching story of the week, which kind of happened very quickly, and now we're sort of in this holding pattern with it, which is that Angel City superstar, homegrown young forward Alyssa Thompson has been pretty significantly linked to a mid-season transfer to Chelsea in the WSL in England. We'll see if we get updates after this recording to officially finalize terms, but we can definitely say that she missed Angel City's game this weekend with an excused absence. The writing appears to be on the wall here. I think the question is more of a how rather than an if. So let's dive into this. I think we're going to act like it's happening. I think even if we get some like back and forth in the future in the next couple of days, I still think this is a really good conversation to have because it feels sort of like the peak, perhaps, data point of a trend that we've been talking about on this show since the very beginning of the year and in years past. So to start, and I think to encapsulate it, we're talking about transfers out of the NWSL by top line US Women's National Team, or even let's just say top line stars. We talked about it with Naomi Girma in the off season. It's been an ongoing topic of conversation around Trinity Rodman as she figures out her future for next year. And I'm going to start with sort of a baseline for me because it's my show. I've always been pretty level-headed about transfers in and out of the NWSL since probably the first true like big ring-a-ding-ding alarm bell, which was Sam Kerr leaving at the end of 2019. Players come in, players go out. The U.S. Women's National Team specifically asks different things of different players every cycle. Everyone has personal considerations as to why they want to be in one position or the next, or one country or the next. These are people making personal decisions about their personal lives, family considerations, life stage of career, all of that stuff. I, in the past, and in so many ways still feel this way, that every case happens on their own merit, and you have to look at them individually and why any individual player might want to make any individual move. And this is an important baseline for, I think, the rest of this conversation, I still believe that the NWSL offers a level of weekly competition that can be incredibly valuable to a player. It doesn't hurt that the NWSL can get you in front of big crowds every week close to home if you are an American player. But this one feels different. This one feels not amazing. The idea of an Alyssa Thompson transfer, just little pieces of it, I think make it feel a little bit more tense or a little bit more intense than maybe something like Girma's move in the offseason. This is a homegrown face of the franchise, player under the age of 21 who just signed a multi-year extension to stay home and build something special with her hometown team. This is a mid-season move, very last minute, as Angel City is 1 point off of the playoff line. And we've been raving about Thompson constantly this season. I don't think you can go through any of these episodes this year without hearing me talk about what she's been able to do. She's been a menace on the pitch for club and for country. She is, by my measure, again, the U.S. Women's National Team breakout star of the year. You can go back. I based all of Angel City's hopes and dreams on this player earlier this season, as you might recall. And so all of that, the timing and the plans that had been made for her future in the United States before this call, the fact that it's happening as she's kind of in this ascendant state of becoming a mainstay for the U.S. Women's National Team, all makes this feel a little bit different. And I know the offer is going to be for a lot of money, and that's the piece of the puzzle that we don't have yet. But these other considerations that we always talk about when we're talking about the balance of NWSL top-line players in and out doesn't feel to be quite balanced in the way that it used to. So that's significant enough that I'm compelled to kind of sit down and talk about big picture state of the game. The WSL in England kicks off this weekend with more momentum than ever. The NWSL is seeing one team, Kansas City, run away with the Shield. And everything after the midseason break has felt a little bit up and down for a lot of these other teams, a lot of streaky form. We're seeing a lot of clubs in the top 5 that haven't had a win in a while. And as always, players come in, players go out. But this does feel like a crucial moment in time for the global game and the NWSL's place in it. And I think that's worth some reflection. So I've broken this down into 3 major points in my head. And I think point number 1 that makes this really interesting as we talk about these U.S. women's national team players is we're seeing big American women's soccer investors turning their attention to Europe right now. Probably always good to follow the money first, right? So let's start there. The Thompson transfer is just another one of those data points where you're looking at a player move from the NWSL to a big European club, and there are American investors involved. It's ironic, I think, that Angel City minority investor Alexis Ohanian is also a minority investor in Chelsea. He bought in at a pretty high price point. I think it was not a huge investment, nothing like he is not in charge of what Chelsea is doing, but he thought it was the right thing to do for his sort of investment portfolio to invest in Chelsea over the offseason. After kind of with that breakdown in the sell to Willow Bay in LA, sounds like it was kind of a frustrating experience for Ohanian in the club governance with Angel City starting that team off. We've also seen, as we know, huge major player in just women's sports in general, Michelle Kang, is really stretching the concept of where her interests lie in terms of her sort of global football empire. She has another huge contract negotiation going on with an American player, with an American club, as we know, with Rodman and the Washington Spirit. But she's got 2 major interests outside of the Spirit now, right? In Lyon and the newly promoted London City Lionesses, who I think are poised to ruffle feathers on both sides of the pond this year. I can't wait to see what they end up doing this year. And her investment in Lyon has been pretty significant pretty quickly, which makes sense. That club is the crown jewel in the European market for an owner like that. They're champions of France many times over, perennial Champions League contenders and winners. The history of that club is second to none. There's a reason why this one is important to Kang. She moved Spirit manager Jonathan Heraldez over to Lyon mid-NWSL season. We've gotten some reporting that both sides maybe thought that was the right thing to do. And she's been pretty aggressive in the European offseason in consolidating American talent. You know, they've got Lindsay Horan already, but they signed Corbin Albert, and they sign the big picture one is they signed Lily Johannes, who, as we know, is like the best American midfielder since Sam Mewis. Lyon is sort of that potent mix of international talent, but a trio of American midfielders, 2 of whom are firmly ensconced in the senior U.S. women's national team, is sort of a significant, not necessarily shift, but an important moment for Lyon as well. And London City in England are going to make waves immediately. They've been less focused on U.S. women's national team talent. They are not there yet. They just were promoted from the former WSL championship. I think it's now called WSL 2. But they have found a way to at least get, I don't know if this is going to be, again, like the most potent mix of players, but let's say they've gotten some big names, right? Danielle Vandedock, Nikita Paris, Kosavari Aslani, Saki Kumagai, and they've recently dipped into the NWSL market, taking Alana Kennedy and Katie Zalem off of Angel City's hands during this transfer window. I'm not getting into the Angel City of it all because there's too much to talk about, but they're having an interesting time. And to be frank, Kang has seen a lot of upward mobility in England without having to completely break the bank. She's made a serious investment in the London City Lionesses, and year after year within that investment, she has gotten them all the way to the top tier league in the country. Now, this is where things get hard, right? I'm not going to act like London City is coming in and winning the WSL or even necessarily qualifying for Champions League this year. It's hard to win the WSL, just like it's hard to win in the NWSL. But we have also, though, seen Kang really test the limits of what consistent investment can do at the independent level in England. And the returns have been good so far. And I think she has to think, okay, how do we now take that next step to actually compete with a team like Manchester City, Arsenal, Chelsea, something like that? And that, while being its own difficult project, what she's done so far in sort of a weird way has been more easy than it might be to win an NWSL championship with the Washington Spirit, considering some of the specificities of what it means to compete in the NWSL, which leads us to the big picture conversation, which we talk about a lot with these players, which is parity rules, the salary cap, any other things that you might see in terms of trades or transfers that limit what a club can do in the NWSL to stock up on their roster. And when you do have an owner who has a salary cap in one league and does not have a salary cap in 2 other leagues, that changes the conversation. even if what that conversation is, oh, we want this player for Lyon rather than this player for Washington, a player that was maybe already outside of the US, that's different. That is something that the NWSL is losing out on. And I also think that additionally adds to some of the perception issues for the NWSL when you have players kind of have these dreams of being a professional footballer. You can't make as much money in the NWSL. There's no UEFA Champions League, famously, not in Europe. The number of teams are at this point kind of content not to try to win trophies at the club level. We're seeing players struggle to find best fits for their personal goals as US Women's National Team players. And there is even just a football bias that tips towards Europe because Europe is football mad. That is the premier sport over there, as opposed to the United States, where there's a lot of competition. And I do just think it's notable that the league's biggest ownership partners are starting to feel the same way. Or at least we're starting to see them diversify those investment portfolios so they don't have all of their eggs in one particular basket. The NWSL is trying to create something brand new. And I think that these owners are completely on board with that. There just isn't that football infrastructure that they have in England, they have in Europe. And that is a difficult road and a different road. But again, I think the fact that you're seeing owners start to think about what they can do in Europe right now, rather than just sort of focusing in on that more difficult path, more unique path, more trailblazing path, is something to pay attention to. The next point that I think comes up a lot, and this is not the first time it's come up on this show, is that the NWSL isn't just the US Women's National Team's league anymore. And this isn't a new conversation. And I think this also has a lot of benefits in addition to some of these more difficult conversations about US Women's National Team players. You don't get, the Temwa Chawingas, the Barbara Bandas, the Astairs by over prioritizing the needs of the US Women's National Team. That's not healthy for an NWSL ecosystem either. The pendulum is swinging in a different direction, and I think that's a good thing. But we're also seeing the NWSL struggle to have things both ways, with a player like Girma out, Thompson concerns again where Rodman's at. We're going to see Sophia Wilson making decisions about her future in the upcoming years. And it's also notable that a player like Johannes, who moved to Europe as a kid to develop her footballing sense to become a better soccer player, isn't ever really considering a move stateside, nor do I think she should. I mean, some of the stuff I'm talking about, it's not even really a judgment call. It's just kind of things as I see it. Macario, similarly, has been very happy to play her pro football in Europe since she graduated from Stanford. And she's one of the best and brightest that the U.S. has in terms of a soccer player. It's not just a league level issue either. It is sometimes a club level issue where if you don't have the infrastructure, as we've talked about, a player having to make those decisions for them, and also a player that is looking to succeed at the U.S. Women's National Team level, in addition to the club level, has to make those right decisions for themselves. And so if club goals don't coincide with U.S. Women's National Team player goals, that becomes a problem for these NWSL clubs in terms of trying to compete with other clubs, other markets for these players' talents. And that lies, I think, on the shoulders of a club like Angel City. I think we've really, we tear our hair out trying to see them get serious. But I think it also, again, speaks to the fact that they're trying something new and trying to create something that hasn't existed before. But it does mean that right now, one of the NWSL's premier clubs that is doing financially very well, that gets the really big crowds, that just moved into their own facilities, that are, by everything I've seen, pretty awesome, still is cultivating an environment in whatever way that this kind of a last-minute mid-season offer that would get picked up is possible. And I think that that's kind of a tricky question for the NWSL at the club level as well. And fundamentally, we're seeing a shift at the U.S. Women's National Team level too. Emma Hayes, the manager of the U.S. Women's National Team, has very kind thoughts towards the WSL. That is where she coached, as we know, for a very long time. When she was just a club coach, not an international coach, she would write things as a pundit talking about specifically the U.S. players need to diversify their experience to continue to compete at the international level. She was pretty against, again, as a pundit, and so I'm not completely holding her to this exactly in one particular way as a coach, but she was pretty against the idea that the U.S. should all play in the NWSL, or the fact that the NWSL has unique things that they can hand its top line stars, or overwhelmingly to a point where they should not be playing against the players that they will be playing at the international level week in and week out, that they shouldn't be learning different tactical ideas, that they shouldn't be moving into these clubs with this kind of long-standing football history. She's talked about that. And that is a shift in tone from the top. The U.S. has always been somewhat friendly to the idea of, off cycle, players go do their short-term loans. They go play in Europe. They play in Champions League a year or two. They take time off, dip their toe, and then they come back, right? But these transfer fees that we're seeing now at the European level, these are not indicating that anyone's coming back anytime soon. The transfer fees and contract terms indicate much longer stays. And I think that that has the full support, genuinely, of the U.S. Women's National Team in a new way for the first time. I just think that that's very different than what we've seen in the past. This is where I do say that I don't know if I always agree with that idea. I absolutely think that the diversification of experience is incredibly important for the U.S. Women's National Team. I think Chelsea's roster stashing concerns me. We have seen players, not necessarily U.S. players, but like even specifically like Canadian players go over and play for a team like Chelsea, and then they don't play, or they only play in cup competition, or they only play when the top line players aren't available, or they're doing rotation for load management. Roster stashing can be really bad for player development too. I do not adhere. Here's my NWSL take. I do not adhere to the idea that training can be harder than games, and that's good for a player. Games need to be hard, and you need to be playing in those hard games. I don't adhere to the idea that you can develop the way that you need to on the training pitch. You have to be playing in games, and I think that's a pretty commonly held opinion. I'm not worried about that for Thompson. She is maybe the enigma in all of this. I actually think this is a really cool opportunity. I think that she's going to do really well there, and I think setting those challenges for herself is incredibly important. This is not about the player's decision. This is not about anything about why she might be wanting to make this move. It's more just about the ecosystem around it. And so you are going to see, going back to Hayes and the idea of a player like Thompson having the full support of her U.S. Women's National Team manager, I do think that opens things up in the way that the NWSL used to have more of a cultural monopoly on these players. And I just don't think that's true anymore. I think that's great if you're a U.S. Women's National Team fan. I think this is really neat as someone who covers the U.S. Women's National Team. We're going to be seeing a different type of team than we're used to seeing. But it does mean that the NWSL has to try harder to get these different, ecosystems together to retain these players. Point number 3, talk about cultural monopolies. I think the Women's Super League is uniquely poised to have an incredibly popular season this year. They boast the reigning Champions League winner in Arsenal, which is honestly in many ways like it's a total ecosystem shifter. It changes the momentum going into the regular season. It kind of takes the monkey off of the WSL's back of how they were having trouble to get over that top line in Champions League against these teams like Barcelona or Lyon. We're seeing this idea that the WSL, which in its own way is still more of a fledgling league than I think it gets credit for, the ability to actually compete with some of these other top European teams, as well as giving people weekly action that they really enjoy. And then even bigger deal, England just won back-to-back Euros titles. This is their moment. This is when you talk about the tides shifting and, again, the cycle of success. I know England's win at the Euros was a little bit, let's just say, like against the run of play at times. But we've seen the U.S. do this too, where the U.S. doesn't have to be the best team in a tournament. But if they go win it and they come back, the public responds. And I think that this could be the year where we see the WSL kind of take what I always thought was a little bit of a premature, declaration that they had cultivated the best league in the world and try to turn that into an actual reality. The spending itself supports that. Top line clubs are spending and they're not afraid to keep going. We're seeing what Chelsea has paid for Girma, what they're paying for a player like Thompson, investing in these U.S. players. I do think it's cool that the U.S. players are kind of testing the market in that way. I want U.S. players to be participating in the global football market in that way. What we're seeing Arsenal spending on Canadian international Olivia Smith, which broke the record just a couple months ago before, we're seeing records broken over and over and over again. Manchester City is still ridiculously deep. I would love to see a healthy Manchester City this year. Fingers crossed for Bunny Shaw. I want to see it. I want to see Man City make a real jump, try to really compete for the top line of the WSL. We can always argue, as I said, best team in the world, best league in the world, up and down and sideways. But it's just true that for better or for worse, no one in the NWSL is stalking stars quite like the actual top teams in England. Does that always make it fun to watch every week? No, I'm going to be honest. But does that mean that these best teams are putting something together that, due to different rules in the NWSL, their top teams cannot, and probably, frankly, with, I don't know if ownership even has the pockets to do so? Also, yes. And this is the time to do it. This is the time to strike, not only because you have the public behind you, but Barcelona's overall money troubles have impacted their transfer season significantly. we could watch them win everything again, but they are kind of stuck in this transfer stagnancy due to some of the club finances overall. Even me, who has covered women's soccer, for a number of years now, just watching the norms shift in England about where these women's teams are allowed to play regarding the men's stadiums. I remember in 2019, it was a non-starter. Especially if you were an American, being like, the women should play in good stadiums, and then you'd get a lot of reasons why that wasn't possible. That's not true anymore. And I do think you can credit that to some of the Euro success and even just some of the investment in these clubs. The norms are changing. People are excited about these teams in England, and they're playing in these big stadiums, and they're selling tickets, and it's a football mad culture. I also think the Champions League, again, has to feel as much for the taking as it possibly could be, whether true or not. This is always the thing with Chelsea. They love to stock up to try to finally get that Champions League success. We'll see if they can do it. But there is this ecosystem here. I keep saying ecosystem, but it's true. This touch point where England, the WSL and these clubs in England have to feel like there is a chance to start to slam the door on some of these conversations. And if they miss this window, things are going to backslide again for them. I also think the TV deal for them is only okay in terms of money, but these huge men's clubs, it doesn't really matter. They're like printing money, right? And there is at least over 100 million pounds of investment being put in on the TV side during this TV deal. But like I said, there's a lot of momentum here to turn something that, again, the Sam Kerr transfer in 2019 felt like the moment that England was ready to say, we're doing it. And maybe it comes 6 years later, but they are poised, I think, to make some of that into a reality. And all I'm saying to all of this, which is not even necessarily bad if you are a football fan, because there's a lot of leagues to watch. The U.S. women's national team is in a great place. U.S. players are going for big money. It's what you want to see. But the NWSL needs to be paying attention, because there's more going on here than just the ebbs and flows of a World Cup cycle. And I'm not always sure that the NWSL is taking this as seriously as they need to from a soccer standpoint. So we'll see how this goes. Probably more news to talk about. We are going to dig in, I think, to more of the NWSL side of this in the future. But I'm really excited for the WSL season this year. I'm excited to see what happens in Europe. And I'm excited to see these big money moves, because it's only up from here. The Late Sub is part of the Just Women's Sports Network. This show is written by Claire Watkins and produced and edited by Parker Fenton. To get more of your favorite women's sports content, subscribe to the Just Women's Sports newsletter and follow Just Women's Sports across all your favorite channels.